as many of you know, our topic here today is this conversation of that connection, that nexus between food security and national security. And I'm really excited about this next panel and the insights that they'll offer on that subject. A lot of really valuable thoughts that they can offer on that intersection of agricultural biosecurity here at home, but also abroad, and what can be done in that arena. I want to introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them for their opening comments. We'll have a question and answer session. Would encourage you as an audience to submit questions as they arrive in your mind, and hopefully we'll be able to make time for as much thought and as much feedback as possible. Our first speaker today will be Alan Rudolph, the Vice President for Research at Colorado State University. Also joined today by Everett Hoekstra, the President of Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health. And last but certainly not least, Liz Wagstrom, the Chief Veterinarian for the National Pork Producers Council. We're going to open it up with some opening comments from all three of our panelists, and then, as I mentioned, going to pivot into a time of question and answer. So again, would welcome your thought and your feedback, but without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Rudolph.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to Agri-Pulse for the invitation this morning to, with my panelists, talk to you about food security and agricultural biosecurity. And what I'd like to do in my opening remarks is just sort of paint the picture from the perspective of a land-grant university. As you know, these were the universities set up by President Lincoln to establish state-funded education, but more importantly, translate knowledge into our communities. And what I'd like to show you is the role we've been playing not only in COVID, but in agricultural biosecurity and how they interrelate. And of course, these schools were all agricultural mechanics schools, A&M. So they've had a historic tradition of looking at agricultural security and transferring this knowledge. And what I'd like to, of course, start out with, and you're going to hear from my other panelists, about infectious disease outbreaks in the agricultural base. And of course, we're all familiar with these in the context of the most recent history, whether it's foot and mouth disease on your right side with large outbreaks in the UK or Korea, but you're going to hear a lot more about African swine fever, and the picture on the left is the outbreak in China, which was really the pandemic before the pandemic. So we lost a considerable portion of the pork source in the world, and you'll hear a lot more about that. And really what the land-grant connections and institutions have done is start to look at this, of course, over the last 10 or 20 years and start to think about how could we build more resilient, agile infrastructure to be able to respond to these outbreaks. Land grants have a unique constitution of federal laboratories, so USDA, USGS, NOAA laboratories are on our campuses, as well as large strategic partnerships. For example, Zoetis just put their incubator down on the Fort Collins campus on our left side, on our left west side of campus. African swine fever, I'll leave to one of our panelists who's going to go into deep, I think, discussion around this particular outbreak and its implications. This is a particularly challenging one, and when I in my career ran the DHS Homeland Security Agricultural Biosecurity portfolio, I led the DoD's Bio and Chem Defense program as well. So I was in charge of Plum Island, and as we all know, we're now moving this to Kansas at the new NBAF facility. And African swine fever has been in that portfolio for at least 20 years or more, as we look at both classical and African swine fever as the most recent threat to the agricultural biosecurity of the U.S. And so we'll be hearing a lot more of that from our other panelists. In 2018, before the COVID pandemic, the current administration put out a biosecurity national plan, which actually took place at about the same time we formed a land-grant coalition called CERES, the Coalition for Epi-Response and Engagement in Science. And this was really to look at commonalities across these land grants and look at assets and constituents that could respond to future outbreaks with resiliency and agility. We've had 4 meetings over the last 2 years and have been building momentum both amongst ourselves and on the Hill and with our partners, both federal and industrial, to look at opportunities to bring this resiliency and agility forward, because we can no longer afford to have a one bill, one bug approach to these kinds of outbreaks. And we've been doing that, and I think it's really straining both our ability to respond and also impeding our ability to create more resilient and agile solutions. This coalition's very active. You can see as UC Davis, Colorado State, Texas A&M, Nebraska, Kansas State, and Iowa State universities currently, and we're looking to add other partners at the moment in other areas like wildlife. To give you an example of the kind of projects that we've been working on, this is an example of an African swine fever vaccine that we're working with a partner on, and this particular platform is very amenable to distributed production of this vaccine. It uses a technology that's already at use in the pathogen inactivation in human blood transfusion, which uses light and riboflavin, a vitamin, to inactivate the pathogen's ability or the virus's ability to replicate, but leaves all of the surface features intact to build an immune response. The nice thing about this is this platform exists in Africa and Asia already in all the blood transfusion centers and would be very easily amenable to producing a large-scale African swine fever vaccine that we're currently developing. That partnership is with ILRI, an institute in Africa and Kenya, where we can work directly with the pathogen because, as you know, we can't work with the pathogen on U.S. soil. It's only worked with Plum Island. There's one research lab at Kansas State in our Ceres coalition that can work with it. But what you see in this picture is an example of the set of assets in this coalition. This is a very unique biosafety level 3 CGMP manufacturing plant, currently producing vaccines for humans, but we are in the process of transforming this and adding it to allow it to produce vaccines for animal outbreaks as well, including the one I described to you for the African swine fever. I want to give one example of the crossover of what we've learned in COVID to ag operations. When I was in the government running these biodefense programs, we often looked, of course, in the year 2003 and 4 at BSC and prions and asked ourselves, how hard is it for these pathogens to get out of operational facilities? What I'm showing you here, a little whimsical up in the left, for those of you in my generation may recognize Ed Norton from the Honeymooners, but we actually have used microsurveillance of effluent wastewater of our dormitories on campus at a resolution that allows us to see viral burdens 3 to 7 days before symptoms appear, or 3 to 7 days before taking nasal or saliva sample would allow for positive detection. This has been a very effective way for us to manage the outbreak on our campuses. We daily look at the wastewater effluents from a dormitory. If it's positive, we call out the people in it to be tested. We remove them from infecting other people more soon before they show symptoms or other positive detection from nasal or oral swabbing, and control contagion that way. And I think this is a very effective way, and I know we are always monitoring effluents from ag operations, but this could allow us to understand perhaps at a resolution that we've not used before as to how we could get early warning of disease, because ultimately early detection is the best medicine for preventing these outbreaks. So in summary, really we've looked at a One Health approach on these campuses. You know, the A&M's colleges and schools now, like Colorado State, largely have been built on ecosystem science. And this is really the kind of resiliency and agility that we're going to build from for a future in which solutions to these outbreaks are more apparent to us quicker. And so recognizing the interplay between zoonosis, when animal diseases jump to humans, or our environment, how we bring urban and rural communities together, or how weather or climate affects our infectious disease spread, is a really important process and thinking that we're pushing forward as we look to rebuild our public health infrastructure after COVID. And then I've used this word resiliency and agility a number of times because we really do need a new approach. We no longer can afford to go after a pathogen one at a time, both from a scientific and investment point of view, but also from a legislative and support and regulatory point of view. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions and look forward to hearing from my other panelists. Thank you.
Very good, Alan. Appreciate those thoughts. A lot of things to chew on there. So now I will turn things over to Everett, who, as I mentioned, is with Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health. Everett.
Thank you, Spencer. And thank you, Agri-Pulse, for organizing this summit and this very important discussion that we're about to engage in. And thanks to all the participants that have joined today in this important summit and the important discussion we're about to have. It's an honor to join Dr. Rudolph and Dr. Wagstrom, who will follow me. And I look forward to hearing their perspectives, having already heard some of Alan's perspectives. I'm already, my interest is already peaked significantly. My name is Everett Hoekstra, and I have the privilege to serve as the president of our U.S. animal health business. As many of you know, Boehringer Ingelheim has a very, very long history supporting the livestock industry here in the United States. Our history dates back over 100 years at our flagship production site in St. Joseph, Missouri, where we started in 1917. And that history has been throughout supporting livestock in the United States. We have more than 3,200 employees in the U.S. on our animal health division today, and our U.S. commercial headquarters are located here in Georgia, where I'm located in Duluth, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. But we also have significant presence, manufacturing and R&D in the U.S. In Georgia, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. So as you can see, we got a huge footprint here in the United States. As a matter of fact, we spend about 50% of our R&D and have 50% of our R&D resources globally right here in the United States. Additionally, more than 50% of our production, global production, our global supply, comes out of sites right here in the United States. And we're really proud of that, and we continue to invest heavily in that. Boehringer Ingelheim is also a leader in human health. And because of that connection between human health and animal health, we have a firm belief that there's real deep connections between animals and humans. And that expresses itself in so many ways, but most importantly, probably in the context of food, and particularly protein supply, as this group knows all too well. And that clearly puts food safety and health at the center of that relationship. We're dedicated to the well-being of animals and humans globally, and when animals are healthy, we believe food is healthier, and we believe people are healthier as well. Our extensive portfolio supports livestock producers with many offerings, the most widely used, well-respected vaccines and parasiticides in the world and here in the United States, and protecting cattle, swine, poultry, and sheep. In many instances, we've pioneered new technologies in all of those species, and it's a true honor and privilege to support farmers and ranchers who help feed the United States and much of the world. If we've learned one thing working with livestock producers for so many years, it's that preventing animal diseases protects the food supply. Recent disease outbreaks have highlighted how important it is to prevent disease. In animals, we saw the devastating impact of African swine fever that Alan just mentioned in the recent years, and that will take a few years, probably several years, frankly, to fully recover. This year, we've seen the impact of COVID-19. We've seen it both in our human health care system and how it's affected that, but we've also seen how it's disrupted our processing plants and demonstrated just how fragile our protein supply chain is. As efficient as it is, it still has that fragile nature to it. And again, that shows the complex relationship that we have between humans and animals. While these examples do demonstrate significant disruptions to our food supply, others, like foot and mouth disease, FMD, present widespread long-term economic damage that threatens an entire food supply and threatens our entire livestock industry. Managing highly contagious infectious diseases requires ongoing collaboration and partnerships between the private and the public sector. As a leading global expert in infectious disease, Boehringer Ingelheim has and continues to play a critical role critical role alongside producers and policymakers in comprehensive strategies to prevent and control disease. One good example of that has been the private-public partnership and collaboration to stand up the recent creation of a vaccine bank to guard against foot and mouth disease threats in the United States. We're honored that the USDA has selected Boehringer Ingelheim to help stand up the National Veterinary Vaccine and Countermeasures Bank. For years, the livestock industry and public service leaders advocated for this important protective measure to secure our food supply. BI produces, maintains nearly 20 such vaccine banks for various countries and organizations around the world. Our expertise in this area now spans 70+ years, and we are constantly monitoring emerging disease threats, and we can formulate new vaccines to combat emerging strains of FMD and other emerging diseases. We're dedicated to helping livestock producers keep their animals healthy, protect our food supply, and thereby keep people healthier too. Thank you again, Agri-Pulse, for organizing this summit. It's a real pleasure and an honor to share this virtual stage with Dr. Rudolph and Dr. Wagstrom, and to spend time with so many people today who are online with us that share the same passion for keeping animals healthy, protecting our food supply, and keeping the world fed and healthy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Everett. Some terrific thoughts there for all of us to think about. And Liz, we'll go to you next here, and it's I'm really looking forward to hear what you have to say, because the pork industry has kind of had an up close and personal look at the question of animal disease preparedness and response here. Thankfully, just the preparedness side of that in the last couple of years with the African swine fever question and debate and preparedness issue. So, Liz, I'll turn it over to you, and we'd welcome your comments.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you, Agri-Pulse, for sponsoring this summit. Also want to thank all the listeners in the audience. We appreciate the difficulty of having to join electronically and how that affects all of us and how we can get together and still share information. Agri-Pulse asked me to talk about African swine fever, and so just wanted to step back a little bit and tell those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with ASF or African swine fever, a little bit about it, a little bit about the outbreak, and then we'll get into the biosecurity topic. African swine fever is a pig-only disease. It has no food safety or human health implications, but it has significant trade implications. So it is a disease that's spread by close contact of pigs. Pigs getting into the secretions or excretions of sick animals. It can also survive in undercooked meat products, and if those products get into a garbage dump that a feral pig gets into, that's one of the ways we think we've seen it spread throughout Europe. Because it is a trade limiting disease, it is also very important that those animals are surveilled and those diseases are reported. There is no vaccine. I was encouraged to hear both Alan and Everett talk about vaccine processes going forward or efforts to get a vaccine. At this point in time, we have no vaccine. African swine fever has been around been recognized since the 1920s in Africa. But what's unique is that in about 2007, we saw a more virulent, more deadly strain of African swine fever move through the Caucasus into Russia and has been spreading west through Europe ever since. In Europe, it's a very interesting outbreak in that it's mainly a disease of their wild boar populations or feral pigs. There have been domestic pigs, there have been commercial farms that have been infected. But as we've watched those outbreaks, and most recently just last week in Germany, routinely they've started in the wild boar population. There's a lot of wild boar in that part of Europe because hunting wild boar is a major cultural practice. And so that wild boar population is managed for hunting. In Asia, it been about 2 years since it got into China, we've seen a different outbreak. That's been an outbreak of commercial farms, and it has spread throughout most of Asia. We've got all of Southeast Asia and as well as China that have had outbreaks, are positive. And again, it has been much more in their commercial pigs. So we've been very concerned because we look at it, the outbreak that has been going on through Europe and Asia is invariably fatal. I mean, pigs who get it, over 90% of them die. It is something that we are very concerned of. In China, it's estimated that up to 50% of the pigs in China died, up to 25% of the pigs in the world have died from African swine fever. So for biosecurity, what do we in the United States do? Our first line of biosecurity against African swine fever is through our border protection. And so we're looking at our Customs and Border Protection. The agricultural inspectors are funded by what we call their agriculture quarantine inspectors. So if you hear me say AQI, I'm talking about agricultural inspectors for Customs and Border Protection. They are funded through user fees on international airline tickets as well as user fees on cargo. With COVID-19, we have had a 98% decrease in international airline travel, a double-digit increase in cargo travel. So by the end of September, in another 9 days, we will be out of money to fund those agricultural inspectors. It's estimated for fiscal 2021, we'll have a $630 million shortfall. So we are very concerned that through the continuing resolution or the omnibus budget talks in Washington, D.C., we need to address that. And that would address not only our agricultural inspectors, but our Beagle teams. We did get money appropriated for additional Beagle teams in the 2021 budget, but it's still a huge shortfall without those user fees. In the cargo environment, we've seen Customs and Border Protection have some really good successes where they have interdicted product that is clearly being smuggled in, that is potentially positive product from positive countries that is being smuggled in as under different codes. We've seen detergent bottles full of pork products. The other thing we've been working on is to address the safety of feed ingredients that might be imported. We get a tremendous amount of our especially vitamins and amino acids from ASF positive countries. We know through research that some of those products, as well as soy products, can maintain African swine fever for an extended period of time. And so we've been working with FDA and USDA to look at those issues and what could be done. And then on the biosecurity, I'm really encouraged on the 24th, so on Thursday, we're having our first meeting of the North American Swine Health Working Group. That group meets under the oversight of the Chief Veterinary Officers of Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And first on is the issue around border security and additional biosecurity. On farm, one of the things we have been doing is looking at that animal feed biosecurity between our commercial companies that are importing products and producing animal feed products, as well as farmers. We are implementing holding times. It's something that we could do to give by any potential contamination, and we're not saying that there is contamination, but there could potentially be contamination. That would give time for any virus in there to be to have time for it to die during that holding time. In other biosecurity, the industry has worked hard on our secure pork supply plan. That was actually co-funded with the industry and USDA, but within there we have biosecurity standards that are auditable. We have industry working groups that are looking at how best to implement biosecurity and to work with government to keep the virus out of the United States. And then finally, I'll touch on just what we're doing with industry-funded research. One of the first things I'm very excited about is that we have funded a biosecurity review to look at what potential gaps we may have everywhere from at the border to on farm. And so within our industry, what are some gaps we need to address, and how can we prioritize which of those gaps may be most important? Through the Swine Health Information Center, with a grant from the Foreign Agricultural Service, we have research going on in Vietnam, and that includes looking at cleaning and disinfection, some biosecurity around commercial production in Vietnam, as well as pork board funded research that looks at how you would address African swine fever in manure, how long it might live, how you could treat that manure so that you could kill it. And there's also been disinfection research that's been funded. As Alan mentioned, that has to be done on Plum Island. But looking what are the appropriate disinfectants that could be used. So it's really been a public-private partnership. Industry is doing a lot on their own, but we're also working closely with USDA and FDA on these biosecurity issues. So with that, I will turn it back to Spencer and for the audience questions.
Well, thanks, Liz. As you mentioned, a lot of different things that you and your fellow panelists have discussed here. A lot of different things to kind of chew on for us. And as Liz mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, we would absolutely invite some audience question and answer at this point in time. But I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and pose the first few questions on my end. So looking at this issue of disease preparedness and potential response, we got to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And though it was not specifically an agricultural disease, COVID-19 has certainly caught all of our attention here in the last 6 months. And so, Dr. Rudolph, I'll ask you first, and then I'll bring in the rest of the panelists as well. As we look at COVID-19 and the response to it, what has the last 6 months taught us about America's response protocols and what we might need to improve upon?
Thanks. That's a great question. And, one of the first things I'd note is that the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, the NALN, which is a node of sites across the U.S., largely in these land-grant institutions, are biosurveillance. They quickly pivoted. So our vet diagnostic lab, which takes 600,000 samples a year from across the West for a variety of issues, reproductive health, not only infectious disease, but moving animals across state lines. That laboratory, like many other vet diagnostic labs, became CLIA certified and is now doing COVID surveillance screening. So our vet diagnostic lab, in addition to supporting that agricultural mission, is now, in our case, doing 2,500 samples a week of our senior care facilities across the state of Colorado. And many other vet diagnostic labs are doing the same. So, the equipment, the PCR equipment that's used to sample animals is the same equipment. The personnel and training actually is as good as those in the public health laboratories. Many of these vet diagnostic labs are also in nodes of human response. But that was an example of how assets within the agricultural sector were quickly pivoted. Then, of course, we have a whole set of issues around food security. Land grants have extension into the community. So a lot of issues around, is our food supply safe as a result of the COVID? Extension services and land grants played a significant role in interacting with the community to inform them about issues in food security around COVID. So, I think that's the first reaction I have. And then, as I said before, the example I gave with vaccine production, that's taking a lot of the platforms that we developed for human outbreaks. When I ran the Department of Defense programs in biodefense and biosecurity, largely directed at the servicemen and women outside the U.S., a lot of those rapid detection platforms, paper-based diagnostics, allowing you to go pen-side, are being transposed from the human kinds of pursuits. Of course, there are a lot of market dynamics in terms of price points that the agricultural sector can adopt these technologies. But what we're seeing is an acceleration of things we've developed for human outbreaks back and forth between ag and human. And I think that's one of the things that COVID outbreak has brought forward in a more accelerated way.
Terrific. Everett, I'll turn to you next. Anything you've learned in particular from the BI side, kind of that side of the equation in terms of the coronavirus pandemic and the response to it here in these last few months?
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. As I mentioned earlier, Boehringer is both a human and animal health company, and that connection between humans and animals is deep and complex. And we think COVID-19 has actually highlighted that in a very, very big way in 2020. And we see that as an opportunity for all of us to respond and see where there are weaknesses. As was mentioned earlier, we still have backlogs in our processing plants, and whether our processing plants are going to be able to maintain the pace that they're on now in order to try to catch up and then continue to provide harvesting facilities in the future with the threat of a global pandemic now on the forefront of everyone's mind. I think the other thing for us that has really solidified in COVID-19 is the mere fact of a potential for bioterrorism. Now, I'm not suggesting, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting COVID-19 was bioterrorism by any means. I'll leave that to other people to decide. But what I can say is the size of the disruption that it has given, that it's caused in our economy, the disruption that it's caused in our food supply, that sheer size of that disruption, for sure, terrorist organizations look at that and see, that's an opportunity. Is there something that we could do there that could actually create havoc in the world's economy? And they now know from this very clear example that it can. So that, I think, makes it even more important that we're looking at ways to secure our borders and secure our borders from a biocontainment perspective.
Thanks, Everett. And Liz, I'll turn it over to you to kind of wrap up this question. Anything in particular, you, NPPC, the pork industry, learned about America's disease preparedness response in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic? Anything learned here in this last 6 months?
Absolutely. First of all, we had a very, very tragic situation where there were farmers who ended up having to depopulate animals. And what we found out is that our national veterinary stockpile was not equipped to handle large animals. They had done poultry depopulation events, but they really did not have the equipment. Want to give APHIS a lot of credit. They found some funding, minimal funding, but some funding within existing budgets to purchase some equipment for the National Veterinary Stockpile. The second thing I think we learned is that with the outbreak, our Nallen laboratories, as Alan mentioned, were very important. They continue to be very important. But we watched the challenges with surveillance that we had on the human health side, where they're having to make up tests. The tests maybe didn't work as well as they could. They didn't have the right surveillance capacities. We know that we need to be prepared to surveil for foot and mouth disease, for classical swine fever, for African swine fever. And we need high throughput, easy to use tests. And whether those are pen side tests that are done on the farm, whether those are tests with samples that can be collected by farmers and then sent to the laboratories, those are things we can be prepared for ahead of time that we need to continue to work on. We have a working group with USDA Veterinary Services. We're talking about surveillance, but I think that's a lesson we can't. We have to take a lot of learnings from the COVID to be prepared in case we have a foreign animal disease outbreak. Final thing I'll mention is that in the next COVID package, we have been advocating not only for help for our farmers who've lost funding or lost income, but also for our laboratories to have increased capacity for that veterinary countermeasures bank. It was in both the HEROES Act as well as the Relief Act that Senator Inhofe and others put together. We're hoping that those provisions can be pulled into the next COVID package. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Liz. So with all of that in mind, with what we've learned here in these last 6 months, with the comments that you all offered in your opening statements, I'm gonna see if I can put you all on the spot a little bit here. I'm a reporter. I like some good hard data to report on every now and then. So as you look at the current system of America's response capabilities, be they human health, animal health, etc. Give me a 1 to 10 score if you can, where 1 being unmitigated disaster and 10 being as good as we could possibly do. Where are we at right now in terms of our disease response and preparedness protocols? And Liz, I'll start with you on this one.
Thanks. I was hoping I could hear other people. I think we're improving. I think 3 years ago, I would have said we're at a 2 or a 3, especially for African swine fever. We're maybe a little better for foot and mouth disease. I think we're in the top half now, maybe a 5 to 6 range. We still have a lot of work to do, but I think we've got a process where we're talking with our federal partners, we're talking with suppliers of both vaccines and diagnostics, and we've got a commitment that we're working on it. So we just need to keep progressing, but we have progressed over the last few years.
Terrific. Everett, I'll go to you next. That 1 to 10 score from where you're sitting on America's response protocols and pandemic response.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. Let me save the score for last, okay? I'm going to start with, I think we're at the very beginning of establishing, the Farm Bill set up 3 things, surveillance, research, and the Vaccine Countermeasures Bank. And we've only started to fund the bank, if you will, from a vaccine bank perspective. I mean, the production is ongoing, the bank will, but that's only the first installment. So that tells me we're still early on in that process of protecting our livestock producers in the United States from FMD. I think maybe Alan is better equipped to answer the surveillance piece of that and has already addressed it in his opening remarks, and Liz has mentioned it as well. So I'll defer to him on that. And then in the research area, I think the collaboration between industry and education and the vet schools is an important element of how do we work on new and emerging pathogens such as African swine fever, so it doesn't become the next foot and mouth disease that devastates the industry here in the United States. It's clear what it's done in China, and BI for sure certainly felt that in a big way. As for the number, I give it a 4 because we're still early on.
All right, so we've that's where we're at through 2 panelists. Alan, your thoughts?
Okay, so I also would like to get to the score last, and I like the way you broke up the scoring. And I started this business in 1996 with the Clinton administration when he read the hot zone and put the first money into biodefense at DARPA, where I was located at the time. So I've seen a lot of investment in trying to protect the U.S. from what we're in now. And the scores on technology investment and what we have on the shelf that could have been deployed are pretty high. The ability to deploy those in any kind of organized way that addresses some of the legislative and regulatory challenges, I would agree is a lower score, because here we are essentially with isolation and waiting for a vaccine and a countermeasure for a major pandemic. Unknown how we would respond to FMD and ASF, but as we heard Liz say, that the challenges of getting large mass biomass and containment that's been contaminated is still in front of us, as other countries have already demonstrated. So we have a lot of ability in sensors, diagnostics, vaccines that's ready to go. We still can't figure out how to deal with one positive case, so we've got issues of how do we deal with false alarms and maybe using things like artificial intelligence to help us get to that last mile of accuracy. I think the scores on what we've got and what we've invested in are good. And then, of course, the social cultural issues that are in front of us and outbreaks are really important. We learned that in trying to deploy systems of information and data sharing to protect the country. And yet, how we get all farmers to share the data that they get on their farms without worry of retribution is still in front of us. So one of the things that I've learned in the outbreak that we're currently in, the pandemic, is that the social cultural adoption of practices we may put in place or technologies that we may put in place is a big, big challenge, and I would give us still low marks on dealing with some of those things.
Well, Alan, you mentioned DARPA in your response, and I'd like to also speak with all of you about some things that we saw in the 2018 Farm Bill. Wondering, Alan, if you could talk a little bit about the what we saw, that the AGARDA, I believe, is the technical pronunciation of it. Wondering if you could just offer, for those of our viewers who might not be entirely familiar, just kind of a 30,000-foot view on what that is and what it hopes to accomplish.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. The coalition I mentioned of land grants has been behind AGARDA. AGARDA is essentially the Ag Advanced Research Development Agency. It was authorized and not yet appropriated, but it set aside some money essentially to look at a DARPA-like model, which is one that looks at risk in different ways and tries with a set of investments and a unique approach to quickly reduce risk to bring forward new solutions, and it does it in unusual ways. So DARPA was formed at the time of Sputnik in the late 50s when we were surprised by the Soviets going into space. The mission of DARPA, as AGARDA would be avoid technological surprise. And that mission still holds today, allows people to come in from industry, rotate with short tenures, but really invest in critical mass to try to reduce risk out of a set of solutions that could be quickly brought forward for challenging problems that require transdisciplinary approaches. And so it was a small amount of money in the USDA authorization, but we felt as a coalition in series a really important one, and we've been promoting that and advocating its forward momentum. Of course, the DARPA model has been replicated in energy, so we have an ARPA-E. It's been suggested to do so in education with another ARPA-E. BARDA in HHS was also modeled a bit after DARPA. BARDA is the Biological Advanced Research Development Agency, actually, which is funding our COVID vaccine development. So these are models of investment and risk, and we think much like FFAR was intended to be looking at some of the same constituencies going after these transdisciplinary solutions, this would be very much focused on risk, and certainly infectious disease outbreaks still provide some real challenging opportunities to look at this innovative way to go after solutions.
So that's kind of one side of the Farm Bill coin for this panel, but also want to talk, Liz and Everett, with both of you about the vaccine bank. There's been some commentary on that in this panel so far, but wondering kind of where we go from here on that subject. Everett, I'll start with you as the leader of one of the companies that's looking to be working with this vaccine bank. What are some of these next steps that we should be watching for in terms of getting that bank stocked and ready for the response to a potential disease outbreak?
Thanks, Spencer. So as you know, the latest Farm Bill set aside $150 million of funding for those three legs to that stool. The vaccine bank seems to have a claim of about 90 million on that, roundabout. I'm rounding to the nearest 10 million. Of that 150 million. That means this first year's contract really is, as I said earlier, just the first deposit to the bank. So there's more deposits that need to come. I think there's more funding because, quite frankly, the number of doses, which I won't get into, but the number of doses that is desired by the livestock industry, and we look to them for guidance on what's the right level of protection here, what's the right level of insurance, because essentially that's what this is. and we look to their guidance for that with the USDA, not ours. But that would be far larger than what this first deposit is. So I think that's the next step is the future deposits. The second thing is really exploring innovation in the area of emerging diseases and diseases that are not currently endemic in the United States, but are endemic in other parts of the world. Obviously we have programs that are looking at really new, interesting technology in that space. We think that's the right way to go, and we think that's the long-term perspective that needs to be part of the puzzle that we put together to protect our livestock industry here in the U.S. Our tagline at Boehringer Ingelheim is value through innovation, and we are essentially an innovation-driven company, and that's what we seek to do, and that bring that value through the innovation that we discover on our own, and also in collaboration with the educational institutions and the public sector around the world.
So Liz, he mentioned in his response there that they're going to look to the livestock industry for a number of these questions. As this panel is representative of the livestock industry, what are some of these things to come in the eyes of you and NPPC as we continue to build up this vaccine bank?
Sure. And first, I want to mention all three of those, what we called our three-legged stool. All three of those programs are very important to our industry. When we started advocating for the funding for the Farm Bill, we were looking at somewhere around $1.1 billion that we felt we needed for those three programs. We received $150 million. So we obviously did not get the amount of funding that we thought was necessary. We based a lot of that on estimates from Dr. Jim Roth at Iowa State had put together an estimate of doses needed as well as potential costs. And we're not involved in any of the contract negotiations, so we don't know how many doses or how much they cost with USDA, and that's the way it be as industry. We don't need to be in those discussions. But we also felt it was extremely important to build capacity in our National Animal Health Laboratory Network. Our state diagnostic laboratories are going to be a essential component of any identification and response to an outbreak. And so they've been underfunded for years. They've been asking for a minimum of $30 million a year, getting around $17 million. So just in regular appropriations, they're incredibly underfunded. And then the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program is the one we haven't talked about. That is grants to our not laboratories, as well as grants to our land-grant universities, some industry groups, to look at preparedness and response. And so there are, as an example, in the pig industry, one of those grants is funding training of non-veterinary sample collectors, so that farmers or farm workers could go in, collect blood, collect other samples that could be used in the case of an outbreak, and those would be certified samplers. So all three of those programs are essential. We have it in now as a baseline in the Farm Bill. You can be assured in the next Farm Bill, the barnyard, as we call it in Washington, D.C., the barnyard groups will be trying to up that funding amount.
Of course, we would expect nothing less. Liz, I'll stick with you. We've got a question that was submitted from the audience for you, asking you to explain a little bit about something called AgView and how pork producers might be able to use it in preparedness for a foreign animal disease.
So AgView is a pork checkoff funded data management system. And it is something that producers could use to track laboratory results, movement data, inventory data, and those are the data, as well as biosecurity plans, etc. That's the data that, in the case of an outbreak, a state animal health official is going to need to be able to issue a permit to move animals. So it'll all be in one place. The goal is to make it consistent with the data management systems that the state animal health officials use, whether it is USDA's EMERS program or other programs used by state animal health officials, so that a farmer that's got all of their information accessible by AgView should be able to give that state animal health official permission to see that data, and the state animal health official will have the information upon which to base permitting decisions. So it's really a conduit from the farm to the state animal health official on the data needed to be able to assess movement permitting in the case of an outbreak. And I think it's going to be up and going in November, is my understanding.
Very good, very good. Well, I tell you what, folks, we are looking at just a touch more than 5 minutes here remaining in our discussion. So a bit of a last call of sorts for our audience in terms of if there's any questions that you might have for our panel. But another one that's submitted from the crowd that I'll pose first to you, Alan, is just thinking about that broad question of what does keep you up at night? When you think about where we sit and the structures that we currently have, what keeps you up at night in terms of what might be a weakness point in that current framework?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, in my 25-year experience with this, it's early warning. The sooner you have detection of a problem, especially of a magnitude like African swine fever or COVID-19, the better you have a chance of mitigating its consequences. And so what keeps me up a little bit at night now is the fact that we're getting closer to the technological success of doing that. A pen-side diagnostic that could be connected to something like AgView that would allow for that really early warning and allow for essentially management of a pandemic like we're seeing across the globe in agriculture in the U.S. And what keeps me up at night is, will we have the will to use it, and will we have the funding, as Liz said, the support to see the infrastructure that's built to make it resilient for multiple outbreaks, so that we get out of just one bug, one response sort of profile. If we respond to COVID-19 well in the next year, it should teach us how to respond to the next ag pandemic or human pandemic in ways that we currently haven't captured. So that keeps me up at night. Early warning and the building of resilience behind it.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Liz, your thoughts on what keeps you up at night and this, any particular weaknesses you might see in our current framework?
One of the things I get really fired up about is that I think we're moving forward. We have a group of the 15 leading swine states, the state veterinarians for those states, meet once a week with USDA officials and talk about really how they intend to handle an outbreak as far as permitting, putting together control zones, what we do in that first 72 hours of a stop movement. And I think we're making progress in really developing the actual logistics of what would happen, what they would do. And the thing that keeps me up at night is in the case of a really bad, one of those outbreaks, we move from the scientific arena to the political arena. And what state governor or state secretary of agriculture is going to say, hands off, we're just going to make our state an island, and we're not going to accept the pre-agreed upon responses that we have been working on. And so we are working really hard on responses. I think we'll get there. I think we'll have a good scientific basis for them, and the challenge will be when it goes from scientific to political.
Very good, very good. And I know, Everett, we're having some technical difficulties with your video. Are you able are you still able to hear us, Everett?
Yep, I can hear you fine, Spencer.
Very good. So I guess just your thoughts on what in particular keeps you up at night in this current framework.
Well, what keeps me awake at night is cross-border protection against foreign and endemic diseases in other countries finding their way into the United States. So ASF, whether it's ASF, FMD, or the next major outbreak that happens somewhere in the world that isn't happening in the U.S., it's that protection. And Liz's comment earlier just made that stayed awake for sure for the next 9 nights as we wonder where the funding is going to come for the agricultural quarantine inspection service, because I think that's really going to be important. That's what keeps me awake at night, and I want to say a huge thank you to our livestock producers and all that you do to provide the food on our tables. It is uninterrupted, certainly through and when it is interrupted, it's through no fault of yours. And we know that, and so we have a huge respect and appreciation for our producers around the United States and around the world. Thanks.
One of these days, I'm going to learn how to do this. One of these days. I appreciate Alan flagging me down for that. So, as I said, looking at the clock, I think that's about the amount of time that we have. But Liz, Alan, and Everett, really appreciate all of you taking the time, not only just to join us, but to offer some really valuable insights on this subject.